we're all here for a common reason, to find ways together, to work together, to take fast action on climate change, and in particular to reduce methane emissions. The United States is fully supportive of the call to fast action to reduce methane emissions, and we're moving more aggressively than before to tackle the climate crisis. And I say that having worked at EPA during the Obama administration, where I thought we were moving pretty darn fast. But I'd have to say that the pace has certainly picked up. On his very first day in office, President Joe Biden launched the most ambitious climate agenda in US history. He set a goal of cutting greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030, while advancing environmental justice, creating good jobs, and saving American families money. To get there, he adopted a whole of government approach, which means that from the Department of Defense to the EPA, to the Department of Agriculture, the Department of the Interior, Department of Energy, all federal agencies are rowing in the same direction towards a clean energy future, and they are all so ready to row. In the US, we have a long history of leadership to address methane emissions here in the US and to assist in efforts around the world. As the most recent example, last November, US EPA proposed comprehensive new regulations to sharply reduce pollution from the oil and natural gas industry, including for the first time reductions from existing sources. Again, this is a program that we worked on during the Obama administration, put in place what were then protective and forward-looking regulations. We're coming back again to set those standards even more aggressively. The oil and natural gas industry is the largest industrial source of methane emissions in the US. Oil and natural gas operations also emit smog-forming volatile organic compounds and toxic air pollutants such as benzene that harm public health. The proposed actions that we are taking now under the Clean Air Act would lead to significant and cost-effective reductions in both methane emissions and these other health-harming air pollutants that endanger nearby communities. It is a total win-win-win for everyone, including industry. As part of our November action last year, EPA sought comment on additional sources of methane to further strengthen emission controls and increase reductions from oil and gas operations. We received nearly 500,000 comments on the proposal. If you're one of the ones that sent in a comment, thank you. Our rules are the better for the comment that we receive. And we've been looking at those comments to find opportunities to obtain additional pollution reductions in an upcoming supplemental proposal. And we expect to issue that supplemental proposal soon. This is an important step in helping us to develop final regulations, which we will do in 2023. In addition to the US EPA, other federal agencies are also taking action to support the US Methane Emissions Reduction Action Plan, which was issued by President Biden late last year. For example, the Department of the Interior is taking action to reduce methane emissions from oil and gas operations from venting and flaring on federal lands. And our Department of Transportation is addressing methane emissions from pipelines that transmit natural gas. So we believe that this approach of national leadership with everybody rowing together, action across multiple agencies and ministries using a variety of legal tools is an effective model for other countries as they take ambitious action on methane as well. I want to talk about one of the most exciting things that's happened here recently, and that's the passage and the signing into law of the Inflation Reduction Act, which happened just over a month ago here in the US. It is the most ambitious climate legislation in US history. This law will tackle the climate crisis, protect public health, advance environmental justice, all while creating good-paying jobs and keeping money in the pockets of hardworking American families. The Inflation Reduction Act is an absolute game changer for the US and for our strategy to mitigate our climate emissions. And combined with other actions of the Biden-Harris administration, The IRA positions America to meet the president's bold goals of reaching net zero emissions by no later than 2050. With funding from the Inflation Reduction Act, EPA will embark on the following: reducing greenhouse gas pollution from every sector of our economy by about 1 gigaton or 1 billion metric tons by 2030. Invest billions of dollars in community-driven solutions to address the disproportionate pollution and climate impacts affecting overburdened neighborhoods. Reduce air pollution around schools and at ports by replacing dirty trucks and heavy-duty vehicles with zero-emission options. Create a new fund through EPA that will support efforts to deploy zero-emission technologies like solar rooftops to help propel our clean energy economy in every community in the United States, rural, urban, suburban. And at the center of this law is a strategic approach to mitigating methane, a greenhouse gas that is 30 times more potent than carbon dioxide. The unprecedented resources from the Inflation Reduction Act, more than $350 billion in total, will enable all of the federal government, including EPA, to provide robust technical and financial assistance to reduce methane emissions from oil and gas, waste, and agricultural sectors. So let me give you a few details. In the oil and gas sector, the new law establishes a waste emissions fee for methane from certain activities. These fees will drastically cut methane emissions from oil and gas producers and transmission companies. In the waste sector, the law provides funding for the Department of Energy to support communities with capturing and using landfill gas, diverting organic waste from landfills, and installing new technologies like biogas systems to capture methane gas and use it beneficially for transportation fuel, electricity, and industrial processes. In the agriculture sector, billions of dollars will become available from our Department of Agriculture to give farmers, ranchers, and foresters the tools they need to adopt innovative, forward-looking farming practices that will help combat climate change. The resources in this law cannot be overstated in terms of the impact that they will bring and the opportunity that they create for so many across the country to contribute to our fight against climate change. The United States is so proud of our collaboration with our international partners and our leadership to advance methane mitigation globally. And I know from my own personal experience how many years EPA has been investing in these international partnerships. Last year at COP26, President Biden and European Union President von der Leyen announced the launch of the Global Methane Pledge that Tomas mentioned, an ambitious initiative to reduce global methane emissions by 30% from 22 levels by 2030. 120 countries has been signed to deliver on that pledge, and delivering on that pledge would reduce warming by at least 0.2 degrees Celsius by 2050. Across the US, we're committed to sharing our knowledge and expertise with other countries, however we can, to help achieve global methane reduction targets, especially through our engagement with the Global Methane Initiative and the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, time-tested coalitions that have delivered results around the world. These public-private partnerships play a critical role in bringing together governments and the private sector to reduce barriers to methane mitigation around the world. Addressing the global methane emissions challenge, like addressing climate change itself, requires global action. Reducing methane on a global scale can support the development of innovative technologies, providing future generations with a cleaner and safer environment, while creating jobs, supporting opportunity, and providing opportunity for communities today. So I applaud the collaborative work of the countries to mitigate methane and meet these ambitious but absolutely necessary global climate challenges. There is still much work to be done. I don't need to tell you that. We must redouble our collective efforts. It is not enough to do what we're doing today. Based on rising temperatures and methane levels around the world, we know the time to act is now. It actually was yesterday, but it's now, so let's do it now. Responding to this call to action is an important way to support our commitments under the Paris Agreement and will help us do our part to ensure a safe and healthy future for our children and grandchildren. Working all together as one globe, we will take bold action to protect people and the planet, biodiversity, environmental justice, air quality, health, and climate change. I know that together we can accomplish these goals. We can rise to the call of fast action and walk together on this path to a cleaner and greener future. Thank you so much, and I wish you a very productive conference.
Thank you very much for those remarks, Deputy Administrator McCabe. If I'm understanding the gestures from my colleagues in the front row, I think we've resolved some of the technical difficulties we had earlier. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce our next keynote speaker, John Kerry, Special Presidential Envoy for Climate Change. Secretary Kerry. I'm really pleased to introduce our next keynote speaker, who is the Honorable Dr. Henry Kwabena Kokofu, Executive Director of the Ghana Environmental Protection Agency. Dr. Kokofu, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Secretary John Kerry and colleague panelists or speakers. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I wish to thank the United States of America for hosting this important Global Methane and CCAC Annual Forum. Also, special thanks goes to the CCAC Secretariat for inviting me to be part of this morning discussions. I stand in for the Minister of Environment, Science, Technology and Innovation of Ghana, and he brings his felicitations to the forum. All over the world, we witness rapid biodiversity loss, rivers receding, and extreme weather events causing loss of lives and livelihood. The recent IPCC report released in February 2022 re-echoes the urgent need for fast action. As the world is heading towards destruction if nothing is done immediately. Again, the IPCC has projected the likelihood of some 118 million vulnerable people in Africa being affected by the impact of climate change by the year 2030, if nothing is done to curb climate issues. And here, I want to say that the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which comprises of 55 countries representing about 1.4 billion people, these are countries that are heavily hit by climate change, and they are so vulnerable, the economies are so vulnerable that they fall into this bracket across the world. And currently Ghana chairs the CBF, of which I am the special envoy. So we are very much particular about this forum. The need for fast action is very timely, as the impact of climate change is increasingly affecting both developed and developing economies in various ways. The evidence is clear. As floods and wildfires are no more phenomenon that happens in the developing world, but also in the advanced world. And just this morning, I've been following the threats of Hurricane Ian, and it's quite frightening. The call to action is more imminent than ever, as the cost of not acting becomes dire, especially for the vulnerable economies. In order for us to successfully achieve the Paris Agreement goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius, it is imperative that political leaders quickly act on greenhouse gases emission sources, especially methane. Since methane is a significant greenhouse gas with a high global warming potential that contributes to the climate change. This assertion has been confirmed by the recent IPCC report. Again, I wish to thank the United States for taking this leadership on on methane issues. We believe that we can work together to reduce methane and other short-lived climate pollutants to save this planet. Taking action on methane will bring both economic and environmental benefits, given its valuable source of relatively clean energy if properly managed. Ladies and gentlemen, Ghana is aware of these benefits and the risk of doing nothing. This is why Ghana has laid down strategic mitigation mechanisms within the local context, as well as joining hands with the international communities to identify and explore the opportunities available. Responding to the climate change issues has been on top of Ghana's national development priorities, and that is why Ghana has committed over 30 mitigation and adaptation actions across 7 economic sectors in its nationally determined contributions to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, with methane featuring in the following policy areas: waste management, rice production, oil and gas, agriculture, among others. Ghana is committed to implementing its nationally determined contribution measures over a 9 years period, with a review in 2025, consistent with Article 4.9 to contribute to the global stocktake as envisaged in Article 14 of the Paris Agreement. Ghana is targeting to achieve absolute emission reductions of 64 MT CO2 emissions by 2030 through the implementation of 34 conditional and unconditional mitigation measures. This will go a long way to avoid about 2,900 deaths due to improved air quality. In furtherance of this, Ghana has initiated a number of bilateral agreements with countries to trade in an emission. And an example is the Ghana-Switzerland Cooperation Agreement for the implementation of climate mitigation outcomes under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement on 23rd November 2020. This bilateral agreement between Ghana and Switzerland governs cooperation between the two countries and establishes the legal framework for the implementation of climate mitigation activities. Ghana, again, is pursuing a similar bilateral arrangement with Sweden and Singapore to maximize its commitment. On methane, we are targeting a 20% reduction of fugitive methane from oil and gas infrastructure to promote decarbonization of the sector. Ghana intends to leverage waste reduction, better infrastructure, and improved transportation networks to implement low-emission development initiatives against emissions from the modernization of its economy. The Ghana National Climate Change Policy proposes to integrate traditional knowledge with current and emerging knowledge to climate change issues in all economic sectors, including agriculture. As a co-founding member of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, Ghana has taken on several leadership roles through action programs and adaptation of best practices. Ghana has also benefited from numerous support initiatives, including technical assistance and development policy. Given the long-term cost of delay in transition, it has become urgent for collective, ambitious, and meaningful global efforts to keep the global temperature well below 2 degrees to avoid the irreversible consequences. Ladies and gentlemen, I therefore call on all the partners gathered here from all backgrounds to intensify our efforts to create a better world for our future generation. We look forward to a better collaboration with our partners. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kokofu. Our next keynote speaker is Stephen Guilbeault, Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada, and Minister Guilbeault will be joining us virtually. And please cue him on the screen.
Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis à Ottawa, la capitale du Canada, qui se trouve sur le territoire traditionnel du peuple algonquin Anishinaabe. J'aurais aimé pouvoir me joindre à vous en personne aujourd'hui. Les changements climatiques et l'air pur sont des sujets qui me passionnent. Canada has set ambitious climate change goals and is committed to meeting the 2030 target and achieving net zero by 2050. Earlier this year, I tabled Canada's first ever emissions reduction plan, which sets out a roadmap on how we'll achieve those goals. While Canada recognizes that reducing methane is essential to slowing the rate of near-term climate change, it also benefits global air quality and human health. That is why we were proud to join the Global Methane Pledge last year. As part of that commitment, I'm pleased to share that Canada has released its economy-wide methane strategy. This strategy builds on the significant progress that Canada has made so far and reflects our aim to further reduce methane emissions across the economy, from oil and gas, municipal waste, and agriculture. We're taking a holistic approach where mitigation action is supported by enhancing scientific knowledge, clean tech innovation, and continuous improvement in emissions measurement and quantification. Canada is now on a path to reducing its methane emission by more than 35% by 2030 compared to 2020 levels. We recognize that tackling methane is a global issue, and Canada has been a long-time supporter of international efforts on methane and other short-lived climate pollutants. That is why we recently joined the Global Methane Pledge Energy Pathway as an inaugural member. As chair of the Global Methane Initiative and as an active participant in the Climate and Clean Air Coalition and the Arctic Council, Canada is proud to contribute climate financing funding to developing countries. Events such as this one are key to sharing lessons learned and implementing new ideas that will accelerate our collective efforts on climate change and clean air. Je suis heureux que l'ambassadrice du Canada pour les changements climatiques, Catherine Stewart, représente le Canada en personne à la table ronde ce matin. Je suis sûr que le forum atteindra un résultat productif. C'est dans cet esprit que je vous souhaite une réunion fructueuse, car le climat futur de notre planète dépend d'action et d'engagement collectifs.
Many thanks to Minister Guilbeault for those remarks. So as Minister Guilbeault indicated, our next keynote speaker is Catherine Stewart, Climate Change Ambassador for Environment and Climate Change Canada. Ms. Stewart, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here, and many thanks to the Global Methane Initiative and the Climate and Clean Air Coalition for the invitation today. As many have already mentioned, the science in methane is very clear. The next decade, as we know, will be very critical for climate action. The IPCC says that we cannot hope to limit global temperature warming rise to 1.5 degrees without taking significant action on methane alongside the longer-lived greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide. Scientists estimate that methane has contributed about 30% of observed global warming to date, and we also know that the level of atmospheric methane continues to rise. As we know, methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, at least 25 times more potent than CO2 over a 100-year time frame. It stays in the atmosphere for a short time frame, but the positive impacts of reducing methane are felt relatively quickly. Addressing methane emission also unlocks economic opportunities, and some of them at a very low cost. We also know that methane is a valuable energy source, and capturing it can have economic benefits. We also know methane's a precursor to harmful ground level ozone, so taking action on methane is a win-win-win for climate, economics, air quality, and health. As Minister Guilbeault just highlighted, Canada is taking ambitious action to reduce GHGs, including methane. Our emissions reduction plan sets out a roadmap to reach a greenhouse gas emission target of 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. But I'd like to speak in a little bit more detail about Canada's new methane strategy, which was released just last week. Our strategy builds on previous actions to reduce methane from key emitting sectors. It provides a holistic picture of the many ways that methane is being addressed, and it also provides plans and opportunities for the future. With the actions outlined in this methane strategy, we estimate that Canada will be able to reduce methane emissions by more than 35% by 2030 compared to 2020. In Canada, we know that the oil and gas, the waste, and the agriculture sectors together account for more than 95% of our methane emissions. Relative to for the oil and gas sector, in 2018, We published methane regulations, and we're now on track to reduce that sector's methane emissions by 40 to 45% by 2025. Our emissions reduction fund complements these regulations through investment in green technologies that will reduce methane emissions in the sector. In order to achieve greater reductions still, we're now working on strengthened methane regulations to achieve at least 75% reduction from our oil and gas sector by 2030. In the waste sector, we're developing new regulations to increase recovery and destruction of methane from large municipal solid waste landfills. The government's also working with our provinces and territories to support efforts to recover energy and resources from biodegradable waste. And the government is promoting a circular economy to address food waste. In the agriculture sector, Canada is supporting farmers and industry partners who are taking action to reduce their emissions. For example, the On-Farm Climate Action Fund will provide $670 million to support immediate on-farm action to tackle climate change. This includes actions to reduce methane emissions, such as improved feed strategies, manure management, and bioeconomy. Canada's Agricultural Clean Technology Program will also incentivize innovative methane reduction technologies. Of course, in so doing, we are also working very closely with stakeholders and partners, including the United States. Canada and the US already have a long and positive history of collaboration, including with Secretary Kerry and the EPA. But there are additional opportunities for us to do more as a North American bloc. And our technical expertise, our regulations can be amplified through increased collaboration between our countries. Science is foundation to our understanding of methane sources, and it directly informs our mitigation actions. That's why, as part of Canada's methane strategy, we're committed to continuously improve the measurement and estimation of methane emissions as reported under the UNFCCC. In recent years, we've made significant improvements in how we estimate methane emissions from landfills and fugitive emissions in the upstream oil and gas industry, and we continue to work on further improving our estimates. Canadian scientists are also leaders in the emerging areas of aircraft measurement and satellite remote sensing. These measurements can help us better understand and quantify sources, including fugitive emissions from the oil and gas sector. Canada will continue to work with our domestic and global partners to share innovations in methane science and improve emission detection and monitoring methods. Canada has been a global leader in developing and implementing innovative technologies to detect, monitor, avoid, and reduce methane emissions. Over the next few years, the methane technology sector is poised to grow rapidly as more and more countries work to meet targets under the Global Methane Pledge and other methane initiatives. The Global Commission on the Economy and Climate found that bold climate action could yield direct economic gains of $26 trillion globally. Methane technology and solutions could make up an important share of this and support Canada's clean technology sector, which is expected to grow by more than 50% by 2030. Canadian clean tech companies have been very innovative at finding ways to detect, monitor, avoid, and reduce methane emissions. Canada's methane strategy aims to boost Canada's role as a first mover on methane action. So as we all know, methane remains a global problem, and emissions are continuing to rise in many parts of the world. Collaboration will be absolutely key in progress. That's why, as Minister Guilbeault noted in his video address, Canada is proud to have joined the Global Methane Pledge in 2021. That's also why more recently, Canada joined the Global Methane Pledge Energy Pathway as an inaugural member. We recognize that further emission reductions are both feasible and essential to supporting climate change. That's why at the last year's Major Economy Forum, we also committed $2 million over the next 4 years to fund methane mitigation in developing countries. Canada is also a top donor to the Climate and Clean Air Coalition and recently contributed an additional $10 million over 5 years. The Global Methane, Climate and Clean Air Forum is really a great opportunity to share information and make connections as we collectively seek solutions to drive down methane emissions. Going forward, Canada is committed to reaching net zero emissions by 2050 by investing in clean technology and taking actions through regulations and incentives. There is still so much to be done, and science and technology will lead the way. We are committed and continue working with academia, government, and industry partners to improve our understanding of this important pollutant. We cannot wait to take action. We know the major methane sources, and we have the technology required to mitigate them. Solutions do exist. Implementation across the globe needs to be a priority for all countries. Canada is very proud of its leadership on methane. We chair the Global Methane Initiative Steering Committee, and in fact, you'll be hearing from Cecile Seaway, the GMI chair, tomorrow. We are also a founding partner in the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, as I mentioned, and a proud member of its board. Canada is co-leading some of the technical solutions taking place in the afternoons this week, including the session on oil and gas and the session on biogas, and I invite you to attend these. And in closing, I would really like to thank once again the organizers for the invitation to speak with you today. We look forward to our work with fora such as the GMI and CCAC toward reducing global methane emissions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Stewart. Our final keynote speaker this morning is Martina Otto, head of Secretariat for the Climate and Clean Air Coalition with the United Nations Environment Program. Ms. Otto, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. I am actually delivering this address on behalf of the Assistant Secretary General, Ligia Noronha of the UN Environment Program, who was taken ill and unfortunately cannot be with us this morning. Ministers, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I, so Ligia, am delighted and honored to speak today at the Global Methane, Climate and Clean Air Forum, jointly organized by the Global Methane Initiative and the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. And I would like to welcome you all on behalf of UNEP, the host of the CCAC Secretariat. So thank you to all of you for being here. And I especially thank our partners in the Global Methane Initiative for our close cooperation in organizing, putting together this event. Excellencies, we are set to overshoot the Paris Agreement goal to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Given the short and narrowing window that we have to achieve the Paris goal, methane action, and more broadly, action on all short-lived climate pollutants, is our best shot, obviously alongside the decarbonization efforts that are on the way as well. Reducing human-caused methane, black carbon, and HFC emissions is one of the fastest and most cost-effective strategies to reduce the rate of global warming. And yet, since 2014, methane emissions have increased faster than at any time since the 1980s, mostly driven by fossil fuels and livestock. And we'll hear later today from Drew Shindell, the chair of the CCAC Scientific Advisory Panel, about the projections to 2030. And others before me have said, and others after me will say as well, but it's still worth reiterating, the global warming potential of methane is more than 80 times that of CO2 over a 20-year horizon. We heard it already, the numbers for the 100-year horizon, but I think it's really worthwhile spelling it out over the 20-year horizon because of our narrowing window. That makes methane action such an important step to take right now. And we heard about the 12-year lifetime in the atmosphere, which allows for slowing the rate of warming. The CCAC and UNEP Global Methane Assessment that came out last year brought that home early and clearly, making the case for methane action. But it didn't stop at pointing to the problem. It highlighted the solutions we have at hand. And these solutions are cost effective. In the case of oil and gas, many even cost negative, readily available, and they need to be rolled out at scale. The report also pointed out that short-lived climate pollutant action comes with important co-benefits. They make short-lived climate pollution action a must-do complement of sustainable development strategies. And Excellencies, what are these co-benefits? You heard a little bit about that already, but they include human health, food security, and ecosystem benefits. And the health impacts of black carbon are well known as a component of PM 2.5, but against the backdrop of air pollution and in a chemical reaction with sunlight, methane forms tropospheric ozone, an air pollutant with multiple harmful impacts, and it's worth recalling them. Breathing ground-level ozone damages human lung tissues, with impacts ranging from breathing problems to reduced lung functions to asthma and chronic lung diseases. It can also physically damage plants and impair crop productivity, and that in turn impacts food security and creates negative feedback loops from harm to ecosystems. The recently completed integrated assessment for Africa, on which the African Union, the CCAC, the Stockholm Environment Institute, and UNEP cooperated, identified 37 measures for action on the continent. And if fully implemented, they would avoid not only 50% of methane emissions compared to the baseline scenario by 2030, and 70% by 2063, while delivering against the Africa 2063 agenda entitled the Africa we want. And this translates into avoiding an estimated 800,000 premature deaths per year by 2063. And that comes down to roughly a 60% reduction in disease burden. It also helps preventing the loss of up to 11% of wheat yields in parts of Africa and moderating regional climate change, including significantly reducing further desertification. And if we zoom into the co-benefits of implementing the Global Methane Pledge, if globally everybody does their bit in line with common but differentiated responsibilities, meeting the pledge will mean preventing more than 200,000 premature deaths due to air pollution each year by 2030, and more than 60 billion hours of lost work due to heat exposure each year by the 2040s. And this makes it very clear that these measures are just as much measures to address air pollution and other development priorities at home, while also delivering mitigation. Excellencies, as we all know, political will and commitment is essential to drive action. And so is science to inform sound policymaking. But to lead to actions on the ground, we need the tools and technical assistance. And we need the trust that commitments are actually being implemented. UNEP is proud to enable both in the context of the Global Methane Pledge, implementation through the Climate and Clean Air Coalition and the International Methane Emissions Observatory. The CCAC is the first port of call for the GMP country engagement, providing direct country support, including policy-relevant science, methane roadmap development, institutional strengthening, sector policy development support, and so on. And the CCA sector hubs are vibrant platforms for peer-to-peer exchange and catalyzing of finance. In short, people, plans, and policies. Thereby, we also look at IMEO, and IMEO is a data-focused initiative that brings together satellite data on observed methane emissions. And with that, IMEO enables the prioritization of efforts, including the detection and immediate response to superpolluting events, as well as the transparency framework, effectively enabling monitoring, reporting, and verification of actual emission reductions. And this ability to track and report can increase the trust of others in commitments and pledges. Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, UNEP believes in the power of partnerships and the collective impacts they can have. There's the saying, if you want to go quickly, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. And we're rewriting the saying to go fast and far together. CCAC is a great example of like-minded partners coming together, demonstrating leadership, and we're proud of its achievements and continued success. UNEP, together with all of you, looks forward to turning the methane moment of COP26 into the methane momentum, to spur action in compliance with the Kigali Amendment and beyond, and to spur the needed regional cooperation to tackle transboundary air pollution. A build-up to COP27, celebrating leadership and progress and making new commitments at the Climate and Clean Air Ministerial. I wish this event all success and thank you. And now I'm switching heads because I was supposed to talk in the announcements as well. So I'm actually turning into myself, heading the CCAC Secretariat. And with that, I'm also taking us into this next part of the agenda, the announcements. And the CCAC, as you heard, stands for partnership and support to our partners, be it through peer-to-peer exchanges and the use of our trust fund. And here I would like to express our thanks to the donors, the bilateral donors, but also to the Global Methane Hub, having provided funding for us. And the CCAC has approved the allocation of $6 million from its trust fund to national planning and sectoral mitigation of short-lived climate pollutants this year. Projects funded directly support country needs with country priorities determined through an expression of interest process. So thereby we make sure that we meet directly the needs of countries and make sure that the money goes where it's most needed. With regard to national planning, we respond to 20 country requests, and we're going to support with that 13 national methane roadmaps, 22 demands for improved capacity, 14 national consultants to work within the respective ministries and thereby strengthening institutions. We work on 13 inventories and 7 plans and policies and strategies. On the sector-specific efforts, we support 29 country requests, of which 18 in methane-relevant sectors, with a majority actually in the waste sector. And that's just to illustrate a little bit how we drive action forward as we look at the first anniversary of the Global Methane Pledge. On sector, well, a third call for proposals on transformational action is currently open for a few more weeks, and we're really seeking proposals for worth a total of $7 million to spur the implementation of the engagement strategies of each of the CCAC sector hubs. And I would like to encourage all of you to use this forum to engage in discussions with potential partners with whom to build consortia to access this funding. And besides the funding, I'm also happy to announce the start of the CCAC Methane Roadmap Development Program. And here, through a series of webinars, we will provide tools and advice and facilitate peer-to-peer exchanges as well. For those of you who are interested in learning a bit more about that, please join us today in the afternoon in one of the sessions on policy and planning. We will give a bit more detail on this, and also on Thursday over lunch in a dedicated introductory session. And my third and last point is about a proposal for submission to the Green Climate Fund. And that's designed as a parallel proposal with a technical assistance and a loan component. And it's really at the intersection of agriculture and waste, and is elaborated by the CCAC team and colleagues in UNEP under UNEP's GCF accreditation. And it will include 5 areas addressing waste and residues from key commodities, food loss and waste, composting and anaerobic digestion, as well as sustainable diets, to look also at some of the behavioral changes. And we encourage interested countries to contact the Secretariat to see how we can actually collaborate on that. And mostly we encourage all of you to use this time when we're gathered here in person after such a long period. It's really a pleasure to see everybody joined in this partnership and really create and sustain the basis for partnerships as we have with the GMI and as we think we do at the CCAC as a coalition. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Sato. And I would once again like to thank all of our keynote speakers for being here and for their insightful remarks. It's really a privilege. We're now going to pivot to the next group of speakers, and I would invite our keynote speakers to take their seats with the audience. And if I could ask the next group of speakers to make some special announcements to come forward. Thank you. So our next speaker is Marcelo Mena, who's Chief Executive Officer of the Global Methane Hub. Mr. Mena, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. It's been a long 2 years, and I think the room that's filled highlights the fact that everybody's excited about seeing each other and working on methane. I just wanted to congratulate Canada for their announcement, Ghana and the US for the great strides that they have shown today. And of course, Canada is aligned with science mitigation target of 35%. I'm glad to see you again because you may remember me from the CCAC, and that's where I learned of the irreplaceable role it has on focusing on short-lived climate pollutants. There isn't another more effective institution in this role. And the Global Methane Initiative and CCAC have long been actors in the methane space, and many of you present, the governments here and the NGOs have been here long before the Methane Hub was launched. And we're really excited what we could achieve together, and that's why we brought our whole programmatic team that I hope you get the chance to talk to. We are launched in COP26, and for those who don't know what the Methane Hub is, it's a philanthropic refunder, basically from the major philanthropies, including High Tide Foundation. We have our board chair here, Marissa de Valois here, IKEA, Sequoia, SIF, MacArthur, and Hewlett. We're science-based, and we've really put together what I believe is a world-class team that has a global presence, and we want to be efficient and nimble to collaborate with you. We were born with the idea that tackling methane leaks was going to allow us to achieve quick wins. Because we are able to track these emissions from space and we could show progress. But in time also, we've seen that that's very true for oil and gas producing countries. But for the rest of the world, most emissions really come from agriculture and waste. And it's really about the food system. And this is really a huge challenge because there's no net zero methane. We need absolute reductions. We can't write off some emissions in some other ways. And that's why and really what we do on this decade on methane mitigation will determine our capacity to meet with a 1.5 degree target. But when we do so, we could achieve good development. A cow in India has much more methane emissions per liter of milk. So therefore, they could actually increase production and reduce methane if we do the things right. It also allows us to contribute to a climate smart agriculture and a circular food system. We believe in collaboration, and that's why CCAC has long fostered this collaboration in the waste, energy, and agriculture sectors. And our funding is precisely to that, to support countries in developing methane reduction plans, include capacity building, technical assistance, and focus on neglected sectors many times on the environment agenda overall. It's an opportunity to enhance ambition with this ratchet process that COP26 requested. Also, we think it's important that we use our efforts to really focus on a target and collaborate and not compete. And that's why a really great example is what the NGOs did that were working in China, in which they put together a strategy to mitigate this large country's emissions. And we are actually putting together funding for 9 of these major NGOs who have committed to collaborate, not compete, to promote ambitious mitigation in the region. And really, it's really important because in China or India or Chile or any country, when you look at the short-term contribution to warming, it's not 10% or 12% from methane. In the short term, it's more than 30%. And in regions like India, it's 40% of all the warming that will be contributed will be coming from methane itself. We also contributed to tackle this energy crisis. For example, the EU is in the middle of a challenge of what to do because of the war. But we want to provide evidence that it's really that we want to answer this crisis. The answer is lower reliance on fossil fuels. And the food crisis today highlights our fossil fuel dependent food system too. And the circular economy is a way that could contribute to reduce that dependence. We also learn from the success that we've had before. And for example, the project Chile Canada called Recicla Orgánicos, which was incubated in the CCAC, has been, we've expanded it to other regions in Latin America, and we would want to use this, which is a really great example of South-South collaboration. On the champions team, for example, Mahmoud is going to be speaking this week, and we'll hear Gonzalo Munoz. We've really seen what they've been able to do with non-state actors. And we've seen what Race to Zero has contributed to net zero targets for the private sector. And now they have included a 34% mitigation target for methane to be part of the Race to Zero. And last week, we approved a grant to support the champions team to create methane champions to focus on methane mitigation on the breakthrough agendas on agriculture, energy, and waste for COP27, 28, and 29. So it will be at the Action Hub. It will be part of the non-state actors, and I think it's really important given the way that some of these emissions are set up and regulated globally. A couple of weeks ago, we also showed our support to contribute to additional funding to Africa region in the AMSEN environment ministerial meetings. Leading up to COP, I think it's really important that we listen to the presidency, how we could work together. We're working with the GMP leaders and also to join the Aim for Climate to supporting innovation sprints on mitigating methane. We hope to lead a major research and development effort in enteric fermentation on agricultural emissions because we need breakthroughs in that. And also, just finally, just wanted to talk about the financing. As Secretary Kerry said, the study that we commissioned by the Climate Policy Initiative only showed that 2% of mitigation of methane, of climate finance is going to methane, and less of 1% is going to energy. And where we're really banking a lot of our success, where it's supposed to be happening a lot. So that highlights that the economic case is not enough. You need regulations, you need methane fees, because it's not that it's not profitable to capture leaks in oil and gas extraction. It's just that extracting more oil is even more profitable. So we need to make that short-term vision actually turn into a long-term vision to reduce those emissions. And it's not enough to say, because you've heard it many times, my operations don't leak. Because the satellites are going to be there and they're going to really see if that's true or not and whether the mitigations are in place or not. Finally, we understand that it's really important to leverage more financing, and we're working with MDBs to design methane mitigation project preparation facilities to expand the work, for example, that the U.S. will do on the African Development Bank. I think it's really important that a lot of these projects are designed with that purpose. And even the tracking that we've seen, many of the things that are being invested in touch on methane, but not necessarily are leading to methane reductions. So finally, we're here to support you. We're support the pledge and those who want to go beyond what the latest IPCC report says 34% by 2030 and 44% by 2040. And we are here to accompany you in the sprint that also will follow with this marathon that we require on CO2 mitigation, promoting clean air and better health. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mena. I just want to acknowledge that we are running a little bit behind time, so I would encourage our next speakers to try to keep their remarks brief without rushing anybody too much. Our next speaker is Donald Moore, Executive Director of the Global Dairy Platform. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. And as mentioned, I'm Donald Moore, the Executive Director of the Global Dairy Platform. I represent the private sector engagement across the dairy sector. For those of you not familiar with dairy, there are 133 million dairy farms in the world. And while those of you sitting in the room here might be largely from the United States and think of dairying as a relatively large-scale operation, the reality is the average dairy farm in the world is 3 cows. The other stat that you may not be aware of is that 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions from the dairy sector come from the developing world, not the developed world. So if we as a dairy sector are going to tackle emissions across the entire dairy value chain, we need to have a program in place that allows us to address the emerging dairy economies as well as those developed economies. During Climate Week last year, we launched a program called Pathways to Dairy Net Zero, which is the global dairy sector's ambition to raise climate action across all dimensions of the dairy sector around the world. Since then, we have a very active program in place, both on the research side, which is led by a partnership we have with the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases, very ably supported by the UN Food and Agricultural Organizations. That's working on the research side. On the execution side, there's some interesting developments I wanted to share with you this morning. The first is in the developed dairy economies. We've recently had a meeting with the CEOs of many of the world's largest dairy companies and talked to them about the opportunity for them to collaborate on the developments that they have within their own organizations. 1 + 1 = 3, I think, is the way people tend to think of this, to collaborate together to push forward the boundaries of what we understand about tackling emissions, climate change within the global dairy sector. So that's in the developed world economies. In the emerging economies, though, that's a much more complex challenge for us. And we've been working very closely with the Global Methane Pledge, of which we're a member, along with the US State Department, with FAO, and with the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and have identified 10 countries that between them represent 30% of the emissions from the global dairy sector. Those 10 countries are from Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda, from the Americas, Uruguay, Costa Rica, Colombia, and then from Asia, Pakistan, India, and Vietnam. And we're already working closely with FAO's Investment Center and with IFAD to develop a proposal in conjunction with the Green Climate Fund to start with East Africa as a regional submission across those 4 countries to put in place a funding program for them to transform the dairy sector in East Africa. That will then become the model that we use for the Americas and ultimately for Asia as well. Now, we don't expect to stop with those 10 countries, but we wanted to start with a group of countries that were significant in terms of their emissions potential. And I should have mentioned right at the start that emissions in the dairy sector, 60% of those emissions are actually methane. So when we talk about reducing emissions from dairy, we're very much focused on that methane commitment. And thank you very much for your time this morning. I hope I didn't go too far over my 3 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you very much. All right. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Caitlin Frederick, co-chair of the Fast Action on Climate Ensuring Intergenerational Justice Initiative.
Hello. I'd like to first acknowledge that this week-long forum is held on the land of Piscataway and Nacotchunk and Anacostan peoples. My name is Caitlin Frederick. I'm 23 years old and my pronouns are she, her, hers. With other youth members from the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development and the Center for Human Rights and the Environment, I co-chair an initiative called FACE Intergenerational Justice. This stands for Fast Action on Climate, to ensure intergenerational justice. I wanted to share my appreciation to the organizers today for giving me a space to speak along climate champions I look up to. I would say I hope to follow in their footsteps, but the path is much different for me. The planet is nearing tipping points and self-reinforcing feedbacks that, as the IPCC puts it, could accelerate warming beyond our control. In my generation's lifetime, the world will become unrecognizably altered for generations to come. Fighting to save the planet from spiraling beyond our control is a climate justice strategy. It is simply unjust to leave the planet worse for future generations. It is also unjust to those who do not neglect the planet, that are the least to blame for climate change, but face its greatest impact. We know we must cut superpollutants to keep the planet from surpassing these tipping points while we simultaneously decarbonize. The fight to cut superpollutants, the fight we're all participating in and attending this forum today, is inherently a fast action strategy for climate justice. The CCAC has been fighting this fight for 10 years, and now we have less than 10. FACE Intergenerational Justice was created from a need to include youth in fast action mitigation strategies to slow the rate of warming and avoid tipping points as both a climate and intergenerational justice strategy. We recognize it is critical to involve youth in forums like these because we are the stakeholders. We are the future leaders. We are the inheritors. We are the catalyzers. For those of you in attendance today, I encourage you to look around and notice the people around you. Globally, people under 24 years old make up 50% of the population. 50%. Are they here? Are they speaking up in the technical sessions you attend throughout the week? Are they represented in policymaking institutions like the CCAC that help decide our future? Are they included in strategic guidance for those institutions? Youth are critical stakeholders. I leave you with this. How can you better engage youth in these conversations regarding the future of a planet that we will inherit? Thank you.
Thank you for coming back after that intense and very interesting session we had this morning. Thank you for the opportunity to moderate this plenary session and to facilitate discussion on this very important topic. So my name is Cecile Siwi. I am the Acting Associate Assistant Deputy Minister in the Environmental Protection Branch of Environment and Climate Change Canada. And I'm really honored to be here with an impressive group of global actors to discuss solutions to climate change and clean air challenges that we face as a global community. I think from the sessions this morning, we got a good sense of what the challenge facing us is and what the challenges are and what it's going to take to actually be able to address that. So I'll try not to repeat too many of the things that we heard this morning, but we heard about the Paris Agreement and how we are not on target to meet the 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels that was committed to at the time. We also heard about the fact that we cannot focus on CO2 alone because we have some potent global warming actors like black carbon and methane, which is what we need to focus on. Black carbon especially is a component of fine particulate matter, which is a very toxic pollutant. It's also a potent climate forcer, particularly when it deposits on snow and ice and where it accelerates melting. So as a result, black carbon emissions have particularly strong impacts on Arctic and snow-covered regions. But as we also heard, black carbon lasts less than a couple of weeks in the atmosphere. So reducing emissions now can have almost immediate benefits for climate and for human health. Similarly, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas that also forms ground level ozone, which results in hundreds of thousands of premature deaths annually on a global basis. Emissions have substantially risen over the past decade. Again, because methane lasts in the atmosphere for a decade or so, reducing emissions now will bring rapid benefits for climate and human health as well. And just in case the challenge facing us had been seemingly becoming a bit theoretical and we get caught up in the science of it, I really found the intervention by, I think it was Caitlin Frederick, very impactful for reminding us about why we have to do this and why we have to take action and why it's so important that we leave a better earth for our kids to inherit. I'm not 23 years old, in case you were wondering. One of the things that came through very clearly was the fact that it needs collective and concerted action on a global scale to make a difference. So we know what the challenge is and how to address it and how do we get the global community working together. And this is why I'd like to spend the next few minutes just telling you about the Global Methane Initiative, the GMI. Some of you may already be aware of some of this, but for those who are relatively new to this space, I think it might be useful to just to share some few details of how GMI came about and to talk about some of the partners that we've been working with in collaboration to achieve some of the successes that I'm going to share with you. So Canada is proud of our collaboration with our international partners and our leadership to advance methane mitigation. Personally, I'm very proud to serve as the chair of the steering committee to the Global Methane Initiative, along with my colleagues from India, Mr. Vinod Tiwari, We'll be hearing from him a bit later in this session, as well as Mr. Thomas Carbonell, who was the moderator of the earlier session today from the United States, and they both serve as vice chairs to the steering committee of the GMI. GMI was launched in 2004 as a public-private partnership to advance methane mitigation across multiple sectors: oil and gas, coal mining, municipal solid waste, agriculture, and wastewater. It now has 46 partner countries, many of whom are here today, and who collectively account for about 70% of global methane emissions. As GMI, we also engage with hundreds of private sector, NGOs, and multilateral organizations that all provide critical inputs on how methane mitigation can be achieved effectively, quickly, and in many cases, cost-effectively. GMI has contributed to the global knowledge base about how methane mitigation can be achieved, but doing so from a real-world practical perspective. Our technical resources, tools, assessments, and trainings have reached more than 50,000 people already. Our efforts through GMI have led to methane reductions totaling more than 500 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent from coal mines, oil and gas systems, landfills, and farm manure management systems. Now, speaking to the partners with whom we've been collaborating on this endeavor, of course, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, with whom we're co-hosting this event. And we've worked very closely with the CCAC in their successful efforts to raise global awareness of methane as a short-lived climate pollutant. Also in the development of an international partnership to better track methane emissions from the oil and gas sector, and in their city-focused work in the municipal solid waste sector, focused on financing circular economy efforts. We've been strong collaborators with the United Nations Economic Commission of Europe, UNECE, for example, in developing first-of-their-kind best practices for managing methane from coal mines and oil and gas operations. We look forward to strengthening collaboration with the International Energy Agency in their critical work to increase global understanding of the linkage between energy systems, and methane emissions through the methane tracker. We supported the World Bank's Innovative Action Financing Mechanism to incentivize methane recovery from landfills that reduced millions of metric tons of methane from globally from the biogas sector. We look forward to continuing our long-standing work and collaboration with these partners, and of course, making new best friends with the Hub. Together and grounded in science, we can increase our understanding of short-lived climate pollutants and their important role in climate change. Together, we can use that understanding to raise awareness and to take action to reduce these emissions. So the next plenary session that is going to help us do precisely that. I'm really looking forward to the perspectives of the accomplished speakers taking part in the 3 different panels that we have coming up. First, we will hear from esteemed scientists focusing on the latest advances in our understanding of the science of short-lived climate pollutants, helping us better target our solutions to take fast action towards reductions. The next panelists we will hear directly from representatives of 3 different countries that are taking innovative actions to address methane and other short-lived climate pollutants: India, Côte d'Ivoire, and Norway. These 3 countries have very different emission profiles, so it will be quite instructive to hear how they are addressing the unique challenges that they face separately. And finally, we'll have a 3rd panel on national, multilateral, and non-governmental organizations that will provide their perspectives on how to advance more effective fast actions to reduce methane and other SLPs. And with that, I would like to, we already have our first panelist on the podium, and I'll just introduce them and then they will take over from there. So we have Dr. Drew Shindell, who is a professor of climate sciences at the Nicholas School of Environment at Duke University. He is currently chair of the scientific advisory panel of CCAC. And in that capacity, he led the development of the global methane assessment published last year by CCAC and UNEP. His research concerns natural and human drivers of climate change, linkages between air quality and climate change, and the interface between climate science and policy. And joining him on this panel discussion will be Dr. Lisa Emberson, who is a professor of environmental science in the Environment and Geography Department at University of York in the UK. She has over 20 years experience in the field of modeling soil, plant, atmosphere systems for assessment of the risk of impacts of air pollution and climate change. And she is also on the scientific advisory panel of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. And next to her, we have Dr. Gabrielle Dreyfus, who is Chief Scientist at the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. Dr. Dreyfus conducts research and advances strategies to control short-lived climate pollutants, improve energy efficiency, and protect carbon sinks. She is also an adjunct lecturer at Georgetown University and sits on the Climate and Clean Air Coalition Scientific Advisory Panel. She has also served as Chief Scientific Advisor to the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program. And last on the list is, but definitely not the least, is Dr. Desiree Platter, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at MIT. Her research seeks to maximize technology's benefit to society while minimizing environmental impacts in industrially important practices, using tools and insights from geochemistry. And with that, I'll pass it over to Dr. Shigdel.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to come talk to you today. I probably put in a few too many animations in this slide thinking I'd have a clicker, so you'll be hearing me say the word advance a little bit too often. But other than that, what I'm going to do today is start off by talking about the global methane assessment. We heard about that just a moment ago, that was launched last year as the main report, and we've completed a new report with 2030 baseline report, which I will focus on this morning. If you could advance, please. This is going to come out from UNEP, and really the context for this report is that we've all seen that the amount of methane is growing at record pace. So there's this increasing urgency to change the trajectory. The IPCC's latest assessment credits methane with nearly half of global warming to date. So there's a powerful incentive to act on this pollutant. And methane reduction policies are now coming forward, like the Global Methane Pledge. But we have to put these in place really alongside net zero CO2 efforts if we're going to meet our climate targets. So the idea of this report then is to say we're putting into place these new policies, we're putting in this pledge of reduction. How do we know if we're making progress unless we know what would happen without such efforts, which we refer to in this report as baseline projections. So our goal here is really to examine baseline projections of methane over the coming decade, compare these with the Global Methane Pledge, and talk about why we need to act now to accelerate implementation. So with that in mind, I'm going to walk you through some of the key figures from our summary for policymakers. If we could advance, please. One of the main things we see here is, why is methane so critical from a climate point of view? And on the left, we have the response of global climate change or global mean surface temperature when we change all pollutants by putting in place in the upper line just a pure decrease. It's all red. It's all making things not drastically worse, but it is certainly not giving us a benefit. In contrast, when we add in decarbonization plus aggressive work on methane to really bring us methane down to the 1.5 C consistent trajectories, we get more than double the benefits out by 2050, and we turn this around much, much more quickly. If you could advance, please. The net benefits are achieved more than a decade earlier. So this is really critical when you think about, just think about the news that we see. We see fires in California. We see flooding in Pakistan. We see summer heat wave after heat wave after heat wave, followed by fall superstorm after superstorm after superstorm. Right? The only real powerful lever we have to reduce the rate at which those keep mounting is acting on methane. Right? Doesn't absolve us from acting on CO2, but we get a much better solution when we do both. And if you just on the right side, if you just act on methane under a decarbonization policy, you know, that's helpful. And that's the upper line. You get reductions in methane, but it doesn't get you what you really could get by this focus on methane. So it's great to see that we have actions like the Global Methane Pledge. They're really critical to avoiding damages in the near term. Next, please. We started before going on the baseline projections, you know, where are we starting from? So this is where we are present day. And the real point here is that, you know, we don't have perfect information. We have different teams look at what our best understanding of current emissions of this pollutant are, and they get slightly different results. And on the left, it's in the three main sectors, and on the right, it's in all the subsectors. But, you know, while it's important to get additional information, it will always make our policy decisions better. We can also tell that, you know, all three sectors, for example, are very important. We're not going to make major cuts in methane by just focusing on one sector, right? The same way that GMI has been focused on agriculture and waste and fossil. All of these are important. And livestock, of course, if you break them down further on the right there, you know, despite the uncertainties across inventories, dwarfs the others. It's really huge. So all of these need to be part of the solution. If we could advance, please. Then projecting forward, what we did was get all kinds of different modeling frameworks and different models themselves. We have more than 40 different evaluations of where we're going in the absence of additional strict efforts to bring down methane. And what we can see is that some areas, in particular livestock, solid waste, and the gas sector, are projected to have pretty strong growth in emissions, whereas others like coal, for example, or even wastewater or rice are not projected to grow, and coal is actually declining. So this is really critical information if you're looking a couple of years from now and saying, are we making progress toward the pledge? If you brought down coal by 1% or so, well, that's actually not such an incredible achievement compared to, say, bringing down gas, which you're starting from a much higher trajectory. Next, please. The same kind of thing by regions, you know, bringing down emissions from, say, agriculture or agriculture or waste in either Asia, the Middle East, where they're projected to grow quite strongly. Sorry, it's Middle East, Africa put together. Those regions, you know, they're starting from this projection, which is in the other direction. So it's really important to realize that the same level of achievement would not necessarily yield the same results, right? A flat growth rate in Africa is equivalent to, you know, a substantial decrease in the advanced economies, right? Because of where we're starting from. Next, please. If we put all that together and compare with the historical emissions, what we can see is that compared to constant present day emissions, the baseline is growth. This is what we heard this morning from Special Presidential Envoy on Climate, John Kerry, who talked about the findings of this report, that the baseline projection was a continued growth of a bit more than 10% in emissions. In contrast, if we take the GMP target, this is actually the low end of the target because it's phrased as at least 30% below 2020 emissions. We're going dramatically in the other direction. Next, please. One of the things then to keep in mind is that the Global Methane Pledge is framed as a cut at least 30% relative to 2020. And so that's about 110 megatons per year that we would decrease our emissions. Next, please. But if you compare that with the baseline, which is also the framing that was used in the Global Methane Assessment, which compares with takes into account the increase that would have happened without additional action, then we've got a 36% cut. If you were to go back to the Global Methane Assessment and look at the analysis of what's consistent with 1.5 degrees, which uses this framing, you'd find it's about 30 to 60%, depending on what happens in other parts of the economy. And so this is well within that range, although admittedly it is at the lower end and lower than the median within that range. But that represents, you can see the numbers there, that's 150 megaton per year reduction. That's a big, big chunk of current emissions. However, there's some good news here. Next, please. Is that we know how to get to 150 megaton reductions. It doesn't mean it's easy, but it means that the potential is really there if we put into place, again, all the sectors have to kick in. The size of these wedges here is actually proportional to the median size in which we obtain reductions by current technology and a bit of behavioral and structural change. Fossil fuels does do the lion's share of the work, but you can't get down to this meeting the road to 150 without all three sectors. And one of the really good parts about this is if we can get down to the GMP target, next please, at least half of these measures actually come at a negative cost. Right, so this is super ambitious. It's all sectors, it's all parts of the world, it's all the possible deployment of both technology and some behavior, but it's doable. It brings enormous climate benefits, and much of it is financially very, very appealing. So next, please. I just want to conclude by saying that I've really focused here on the climate benefits, but as we just heard from the previous speaker, and we heard a little this morning, right, there are additional benefits such as reduced air pollution from ozone produced by methane. There are agricultural benefits, which I think we'll turn to in a moment. There are the labor benefits we've heard. There's energy security becoming ever more important in our current environment. And next, please. And we are learning more about sources, and there's fantastic developments in remote sensing technologies and in our understanding of how we can really optimize emissions. We can take out the super emitters, and in certain sectors this is great. In other sectors, that's not necessarily the quite so easy. But despite this ongoing and exciting rush of data, there are plenty of things we can do now, and we just don't have time to wait. So at the same time as we continue to gain more information, we are ready to move. It's the time to accelerate implementation. And with that, I would like to thank you for listening to me talk about this baseline report. Hopefully you will be able to read a copy quite soon. And we're going to turn, instead of having all professors show slides to you this morning, we thought we would change the format a little bit for the next 15 minutes. And all of the panelists kindly agreed to switch to a kind of a discussion. So I'm going to attempt to moderate this, and we're going to talk about science related to methane and hopefully fill in some of the blanks that I didn't have time to cover. And so to do that, I'm going to start by asking Gabby a question. And I'm hoping, Gabby, that you can tell us a little bit more about the interaction between mitigating methane and decarbonization.
Thank you, Drew, and thank you for showing those slides. So I loved the graph showing, and I'm going to explain to you the one with the curve that went up and then it went down. What that means that a lot of people don't realize, because we've been talking about climate change, and when I was in school, it was a problem in the future. I think we can all agree that climate change is here today and that we need to slow the rate of warming immediately. And the global methane assessment and the IPCC report showed very clearly, and that figure shows it as well, that the only mitigation strategies that can deliver on slowing warming in the near term are cutting short-lived climate pollutants, chief among them methane. And that's extremely important, as we are already seeing the incredible impacts of warming at 1.1 degrees. And so the relationship between methane and carbon dioxide is one of time and temperature, and that these are not interchangeable strategies, but complementary strategies. It is essential that we cut methane by at least 30% in the pledge in the next decade, at the same time as we decarbonize, to have any hope or prayer of keeping that 1.5 degree guardrail within reach.
Thank you, very well put. I'm going to switch now and ask the next question to Lisa. And we've heard from both the baseline report and from Gabby's comments some more about the relationship between methane and decarbonization. Can you tell us a little bit more about another pathway by which methane might influence the carbon cycle?
Okay, thanks, Drew. Yeah, so we've heard already quite a lot this morning that methane is an important contributor to tropospheric or ground level ozone. And when people have mentioned that this morning, they've sort of said, well, that's important in terms of food security and also ecosystems. And I think I just wanted to unpack that a little bit more and say exactly how important that is for ecosystems. I think probably when people think about ozone impacts on ecosystems, they're thinking, sorry, can you hear me okay? Is that any better? Okay, sorry about that. Because I kept moving this microphone away from me, that's why. I wonder why. Yeah, so when we're thinking about impacts of ozone on ecosystems, we might have the tendency to be thinking about biodiversity impacts and so on. But one of the things that I think really do need to consider is that ozone is actually, it's obviously toxic to ecosystems, and it has the effect of actually reducing the biomass of those ecosystems. Now, if you reduce the biomass of ecosystems, you will have less carbon held in those ecosystems. And if you don't have the carbon held in the ecosystems, then that carbon will end up in the atmosphere. So you'll have higher CO2 concentrations, thereby obviously worsening your climate change effect. And there was an interesting study, probably a seminal study on this back in 2007, where they actually tried to quantify what the effect of this would be. And they ran through different modeling simulations from 1900 out to 2100. And they found that this indirect effect of ozone actually reducing the amount of carbon held in the ecosystems would have a radiative forcing of somewhere between 0.6 and 1 watts per meter squared. And they compared that with the direct effect of ozone itself, which is the third most important greenhouse gas. So that's important. And that was only 0.35 watts per meter squared. So I think this has important implications in terms of the additional benefits that you can get from reducing methane. I think it also allows us to understand that the benefit of reducing that methane may also provide us with improvements in terms of the natural solutions that we're looking at in terms of our ecosystems being there to sequester carbon in many of the carbon offsetting schemes that we're looking to really help us achieve our targets in the future.
Thank you. So I'm hearing that both we need to mitigate methane and CO2 side by side because of the impacts that we'll feel, but also that there's this synergy between the two, and that our mitigation of methane is going to help us meet our net zero CO2 targets. I want to go back to Gabby again and talk a little bit more about that time scale. And in particular, you talked about the time scale for achieving benefits. What about the time scale over which we need to make the reductions, and what about the possibility of removals?
So I lay that. So I think we heard earlier this morning, and I think a really good way to think about this is we are in the decisive decade right now, but we're actually running 3 races simultaneously. Marcelo alluded to this earlier in his comments. The fast action, fast mitigation sprint is this urgent need to slow warming now by cutting methane and the other short-lived climate pollutants. At the same time as we're putting in place that plumbing and those other technological and innovations to cut short-lived climate pollutants, including black carbon, hydrofluorocarbons, other precursors for ozone, we also need to be running the marathon. We're not waiting to run the marathon. We have to run a sprint and a marathon together. And that marathon is changing our economies to phase out fossil fuels and decarbonize to get to net zero CO2 by 2050. In addition to that, so we got a sprint, we got a marathon, we got to win both to stay in this race. We're also running an ultra marathon. There is too much warming. The blanket of greenhouse gases is already too thick in our atmosphere. And we need to be able to start removing not just that CO2, but also the methane. And that's, so we're actually running 3 races at the same time. The timescales for their implementation are a little bit different. So we got the methane pledge already in place for commitments to reduce methane. We have the Kigali Amendment for reducing HFCs, and we've got air pollution policy is absolutely critical on the sprint side, as we're also doing the investments on decarbonization. It's the ultramarathon that I think is the newest race that we need to.
Great analogy. I really like that. That will stick in my mind. I hope it will stick in others too. Really interesting too that we have, you know, this short-term goal for methane, whereas for CO2 we've got a long-term net zero. We don't really need net zero for methane, but of course the lower we make methane, the more carbon budget we have left. So again, they're connected. Along that same line, I want to turn a question to Desiree now, and I think that everybody in this room agrees we need to accelerate methane reductions. I wonder if you could tell us more about different technological needs to advance our ability to do that, and again, maybe even remove methane.
Sure. So if we consider total methane emissions, not just the anthropogenic ones that we've been talking about today, but the natural ones as well, the ones whose emissions rates are increasing because of this warming we're experiencing right now. When you look at those total methane emission sources, you'll recognize that most of them are not in a pipe and most of them are remarkably dilute, over 80%. This means that you can't light a match to flare or combust that methane. You have to have technological innovation. Dilute sources of any pollutant are an engineer's nightmare for reasons of cost and physics. It's hard to actually get the stuff in the form that you need to be able to react or mobilize it. I'll also note as a chemist that the CH bond is very hard to activate, and there are some good principles behind that. Fortunately, nature's provided two solutions for us. One is with methane reacts with hydroxyl radical in the atmosphere. This is the dominant removal mechanism for methane from our atmosphere, and naturally turns it into CO2 over time. The second is that methanotrophs, or organisms that utilize methane for their own biomass, are able to convert methane to methanol. And the good news is we've made remarkable progress in recent years at trying to mimic both of these technologies. And it's really about trying to understand what is needed to implement those technologies in a way that is going to be helpful at accelerating the conversion of methane to CO2. And remember, that's a process that occurs naturally anyway, but taking methane out of the atmosphere is going to reduce the total potential for its net radiative forcing. I want to just add for a minute here something you alluded to, Drew, in your comments, that socioeconomic and behavioral assessment is remarkably important, and that it couldn't be more true than for our technology tractable solutions, like lowering water levels in rice paddies or stopping the wet destruction of wetlands, advancing methane reduction in cattle, or even something that seems simple like plumbing, better plumbing in the oil and gas sector. Those are actually sometimes hard to implement, and good socioeconomic and technical study can go a long way to advance those solutions. I think these investments are necessary, or else the policy that we're all developing is not going to maximize its full potential.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I showed a little bit about how the emissions are uncertain, but also some of these socioeconomic costs and even the strategies that are optimal to reduce emissions, especially in sectors where it's not end of pipe. Right? There's a lot of diversity out there, so that we have a lot to learn. I'm glad you brought up also the natural sources, because those are both a bit scary and that they seem to be responding to climate change, but also another reason why, like what Gabby was just talking about, we need to act now so that those feedbacks don't get out of hand. And as we heard this morning, the text from the IPCC, right, to get beyond our control. We definitely don't want that to happen. So I want to pose a follow-up to you, Desiree, about the idea of accelerating the natural pathways that we have to remove carbon. You know, I remember back a couple decades ago, Paul Crutzen had won the Nobel Prize and talked about geoengineering and kind of broke this silence on the topic. And the reason nobody was talking about it before him was largely because of this so-called moral hazard, that the more you talk about, well, we can geoengineer our way out, the more that you think, well, maybe that reduces the imperative to act now. Is that an issue for methane as well?
I do hear that quite a bit, actually, that there's this, and I think we can think about moral hazard in two ways. One is that, well, if there's a solution, then we don't need to do anything. And that's how many people receive the development of new technologies in this space. And that's absolutely not the right strategy, just like we can't singularly focus on methane and need to think about CO2 and other short-lived climate pollutants, as Gabby pointed out. On the point of the moral hazard of geoengineering writ large, I think there are two sides to that coin. Something that we should all recognize is that the sad truth is that we are already doing geoengineering, and one could argue that we have a moral imperative to actually undo the adverse effects that we have instituted to date. That will ironically require geoengineering. And I think the other side of the coin is really trying to be sure that we understand the implications of those actions that we take. And the good news is there's typically a finite set of analyses that can be done to help us de-risk technologies so we can ensure that A, they're having the impact we want them to have, and B, there's no unforeseen consequence or undesirable outcome to those geoengineering solutions. I can personally think of specific examples where we've probably drank the Kool-Aid a little too fast. Other examples where good federal investment has led to science that shows there's not as much promise in a geoengineered solution as we once believed. But I think there are emergent technologies that are very exciting today that really need to be de-risked. And fortunately, there's a short number of evaluations that we should be able to do in the near term in a reasonable way to determine if we're going to be able to implement those technologies in a meaningful way.
I think we could discuss that for at least another half hour or so. That's a really, really interesting one. So thank you for that. We obviously don't want the cure to be worse than the disease, but of course, when you look at our CO2 trends, we're nowhere near getting to net zero. So everything else we can do definitely helps. I want to pose the last question back to Lisa, and we've been talking a lot about the effects of methane on climate, but of course that's not the only effect. And in addition to carbon affecting the carbon cycle, can you talk a little bit more about other impacts of methane that we should be caring about?
Okay, yes. So one of the sort of key sectors that you showed, Drew, I think was agriculture. And agriculture sort of gets a little bit of a tough time, I think, in terms of methane, because obviously we're going to have to try to reduce methane emissions quite substantially from agriculture. So in some ways you could sort of consider it a bit of a villain of the piece, but I think I would also like to just point out that agriculture is also a victim of climate change, but also of air pollution. And again, coming back to tropospheric ozone, that does cause impacts to agriculture. But just coming back in terms of the mitigation and emissions, so we've heard a lot this morning already that emissions from agriculture make up about 60% of anthropogenic emissions of methane. So it's a really substantial contributor. A lot of that is coming from livestock via enteric fermentation, but also other activities such as rice cultivation and manure management also play a role, and there are ways in which we can bring in interventions to reduce those emissions. Some of those opportunities and interventions are there, but they kind of need further work. We know, for example, in terms of livestock, we can bring in feed supplements, we can improve the digestibility of the food, and that can have quite good results. But there are also challenges with that. Just as an example, I was recently working on a project in Australia where they pointed out that only about 1% of their livestock are actually located in feedlots where they can actually get to administer those cattle with those supplements and try to change the digestive ability of the feed. So there are a lot of challenges out there still. Thinking perhaps a little bit in terms of more co-benefits, obviously I think we're going to hear later about the behavioural change, the dietary transition that we might need. So thinking about how we might do that, which would reduce our meat consumption and thereby reduce the emissions from agriculture. But again, we need to be thinking about that as well in terms of the livelihoods of the farmers that are producing that livestock at the moment and other cultural issues, which comes back to socioeconomic issues that we need to consider. And then finally, I suppose my pet subject, as Drew will know, is the impact of ozone on agriculture itself. So this is where agriculture is actually a victim of these things. And again, you can gain additional benefits by taking action on methane. So just a few quick bits of stats. So we know that tropospheric ozone or ground level ozone is causing yield losses of around about 5 to 15% across agriculturally important regions of the world. So here, actually here in the Midwest, in the US, we see large losses. Also in the Indo-Gangetic Plain, in India and in East Asia, we're seeing very high ozone concentrations that are causing really substantial yield losses. And those are in areas where we have food insecurity. So taking action there would be incredibly helpful. And just as a final thing, we also did a study in India just recently. So there you can see on average across the country, you see about a 15% yield loss in terms of wheat productivity. We looked to see what would happen if we just removed all the ozone concentrations from the air across India. And rather than just focus on that yield and the supply, we actually also looked at the price. How does that change in supply actually change the price? The price was decreased by about 40%. That ended up meaning that producers actually lost out because they weren't earning so much money for their product, but consumers and the government both won because consumers were able to access food more cheaply and the government was being able to spend less on its welfare schemes. And overall, the welfare benefit of that was around about $4 billion per year. So that, I think, just shows that there are really many additional benefits to taking action on methane.
Great. So we have heard a lot about opportunities and challenges in mitigation. I want to thank the panelists for that fascinating discussion. I think they also pointed out very clearly the imperative to make these reductions and all of the well-being that would result from them, and as well as reductions in future risk. So thank you. I hope we have more time for further science discussions during the week. Thanks very much, panelists.
I'd also like to add my thanks to that fascinating discussion. I'm sure we're all looking forward to the baseline report, and I don't think many of us will quickly forget the 3 races that we all engaged in. So thanks again for that. Thanks for moderating that, Drew. And while our current panelists are making their way off the stage, I'd like to invite the speakers for the second session. So the first speakers, they really set the stage for the second panelist we're going to hear from about the policy and planning highlights from different countries, including innovative actions, successes, and challenges. So we have, I think first up the stage, we have Ange Benjamin Breda, who is a CCAC National Focal Point and Coordinator at the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development of Côte d'Ivoire. Mr. Breda led the development of the National Action Plan for reducing short-lived climate pollutants in Côte d'Ivoire. Next on the stage, we had Shri Vinod Kumar Tiwari, who is the Additional Secretary for the Ministry of Coal in the Government of India. He was instrumental in the development of sustainable development practices in coal mines and in devising monitoring mechanisms to reduce adverse impacts on the environment. He is also a vice chair of the steering committee of the Global Methane Initiative. And last on the stage, we had Dr. Vigdis Vestrang, who is a senior advisor at the Norwegian Environment Agency. She has deep expertise in short-lived climate pollutants. She was the lead author of the Norwegian Action Plan on SLCPs and established the first Norwegian inventory on black carbon. She has contributed to science and policy work under the Arctic Council and Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution. I believe the first speaker we have up is Mr. Tiwari of India.
Thank you, Cecil, for introduction and thank you, Forum, for giving us this opportunity. Do we have the PPT on this thing? Yeah? Okay. Let me begin by sharing that India is founder member of Global Methane Initiative since 2004. We are also a member of CCAC, UNEP since 2019. We are founder member and host of International Solar Alliance. And India is member Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. We recently launched in 2019 the National Clean Air Program. And as a country, we are optimistic and committed to use technology, innovation, regulatory measures for prevention, control, and abatement of air pollution and GHG emission. And after that, good dosage of the science on climate change just now. And I'm happy to note that it's not just the methane that we have to target. The carbon CO2 doesn't get off the radar. India made announcement at COP 26 in Glasgow, and our Honorable Prime Minister Modi gave 5 nectars, or Panchamrit we call, and India will get its non-fossil fuel energy capacity to 500 gigawatts by 2030. India will meet 50% of its energy requirements from renewables by 2030. India will reduce projected carbon emission by 1 billion tons by 2030. India will reduce carbon intensity of its economy by 45% by 2030. And above all, India will achieve net zero by 2070. That's comprehensive, that includes all pollutants, short, long, whatever. Let me also quickly run through the different sectors that are taking different programs, actions, and policy changes, but not forgetting the energy security with sustainability in mind. As I said, National Solar Mission is already up and working. We have schemes that are replacing conventional domestic lights and LED light with LED lights, and bear in mind that we are a country of 1.4 billion people, roughly about 400 million households. Wind energy, we will enhance to 8 folds from the existing energy capacity, and our DISCOMs are being assisted with the financial and operational turnaround, and we still have free electricity to the poor and needy, and India's current consumption at about 1200 kilowatt hours per capita per year. We are aiming it to double it up, whereas the average world consumption is around 3000 kilowatt hours per annum. We have energy efficiency programs replacing conventional ones by energy efficient ones. We have PAT schemes, that is perform, achieve, and trade schemes, trading excess energy saved through energy efficiencies. We are switching our old thermal power plants to supercritical power plants. Not only do we improve the thermal efficiency, but also reduce emissions. And we are replacing conventional street lights with smart LED variants through SLNP. And we have introduced renewable purchase obligations through our electricity regulators, making it mandatory for the DISCOMs to buy a certain percentage of the electricity that they distribute from REs. We already have a clean air program up and running to achieve 20 to 30% reduction of PM10 and PM2.5 concentrations by the year 2024 with a baseline of 2074. And in agriculture sector, not forgetting the food security and the fact that large number of our farmers are small and marginal. They do agriculture not for marketing, but for their own living and livelihood. Is for life, it's a survival. Despite that, we are progressing with the system of rice intensification with methane potential mitigation of about 25%. We are also propagating direct seeded rice with potential to reduce by 30%, crop diversification program, and balanced ration for livestock, as also feeding bypass proteins, avoiding crop residue burning. In oil and gas sector, we have CBM as coal bed methane as alternate source of energy, moving to gas-based economy. We have already allocated 33 CBM blocks having a resource of 1767 billion cubic meters. And we are already moving to ethanol blending program through E20 by 2025. We have a biodiesel policy in place to reduce vehicular emissions, and also focusing on hydrogen economy, blending of hydrogen with CNG. In coal sector, we are tapping coal bed methane and coal mine methane both. And we now have a policy of allocating coal blocks with rights of CBM extraction to the coal block holder and vice versa. We are selecting the coal blocks with lesser forest density areas so that most of the open cast mines do not result in deforestation. We have delineated avoiding dense forests. Promoting clean coal technology to capture, reduce methane emission. And also we are adopting the surface coal gasification with or without CCUs with a target of 100 million ton of coal gasification by 2030. And let me conclude by adding that India believes in emission reduction based on principles of equity, CBDR, and respective capacities. And climate actions and climate finance go hand in hand. And our NDC, climate adaptation and climate finance, have a very ambitious adoption target, which will proceed in consonance with the finances available. Last, India will continue development for all, emission reduction in all sectors, strengthening climate governance, actions in furtherance of Panchamrit announcement that I just referred to, action on net zero by 2070, and demanding just climate finance. Thank you.
Next speaker is Ange Benjamin of Côte d'Ivoire.
Good morning, everyone. 7,000 premature deaths due to indoor and outdoor pollutants avoided by 2030. 30% GHG emission reduction, or if you would like, 37 million tons of CO2 equivalent avoided by 2030. These are some of the key findings or commitments of Côte d'Ivoire new NDCs published recently, early this year. It's the first time ever in the history of our country that we have such a detailed and science-based environmental assessment, and which is also policy-oriented. It's a continued effort over the last 10 years since Côte d'Ivoire has been involved in many assessments and planning processes, such as the National Communication and NDCs, and also the SNAP process, and recently the NDC revisions. The SNAP supporting national action planning of the CCAC has been detrimental to the achievement of these findings in my country. SNAP initiatives has created a space for interaction and discussion between the scientists, the policymakers, and the practitioners in order to establish or to implement innovative tools such as the integrated assessment that was promoted by the coalitions over the past decades. And this has helped us achieve this new commitment, ambitions through our NDCs. Not only the new NDCs for Côte d'Ivoire set different pathways of implementation between conditional and unconditional NDCs, but we also have, through this new commitment, a clear understanding of the contribution of each sector's energy sector, agriculture sector, waste, and also the transport sector. The new NDC commitment for Côte d'Ivoire also has clear targets in terms of SSCP reductions. It's 54% reduction of BC by 2030, but also 30% reduction in methane by 2030. It's also said clearly the benefits that could be derived by the reduction, by the quick actions on SLCPs through the 38 mitigation measures that were analyzed through this process. And this was estimated to 7,000 premature deaths that could be avoided each year by 2030. And Côte d'Ivoire is one of the first countries to report co-benefit, health co-benefit in its NDCs. We are planning to continue this effort through the support of many actors, the coalitions, to develop a clear methane roadmap after the identification of the potential of methane reduction through this planning process. And we also have a plan to increase our engagement with sectors. And one of the key sectors that will be first to be supported is the transport sector, where we also have a clear indications of what could be achieved both in terms of SSCP reductions, but also GHG emission reductions. So I would like to end here by thanking the coalition for the support to the country, to Côte d'Ivoire, in achieving this innovative planning way and transforming the planning and policy making process in Côte d'Ivoire, which are now opening a new era of implementations of environmental policy. Thank you.
Our final speaker on this panel is Dr. Vestrang of Norway.
I am here to tell you about our measures to cut black carbon and methane emissions. What has worked? What has been our challenges? And what can you take home? But first, let me tell you about some overarching principles and commitments we have. In Norway, we have two main economic instruments, tax and emission trading. The government has signaled a gradual increase of the CO2 tax to $195 per ton CO2 in 2030. Also, half of Norway's emissions is covered by the EU emission trading scheme. Together, these two economic measures cover almost 80% of our greenhouse gas emissions. We are committed to reducing both our impact on climate and air quality, and to secure sustainable development. And it's urgent. Our goal is to solve these problems all at the same time and with as many win-wins as possible across climate change, health, biodiversity, and other societal challenges. So what are the actions, successes, and challenges Norway has experienced? Let me start with black carbon in transport. Norway has the highest share of electric vehicles in the world. We have set up ambitious national goals. Also, electric cars can park and charge for free, drive in the bus lanes, and go cheaper on ferries, in addition to the tax breaks and reduced toll. As a result, around 80% of new passenger cars sold so far this year have been fully battery electric. Emissions have decreased accordingly. Now let me turn to wood burning. Two measures have been taken here. We have subsidies for exchanging old stoves to cleaner burning stoves, and frequent information campaigns about how to burn right and minimize the effect on air pollution and climate. Emissions have decreased nearly 40% over the last 20 years. But now we see a challenge in the increasing energy prices. The rising cost of electricity might be an incentive to use more wood for heating. Let's look at methane and start with agriculture. The Norwegian authorities and the food industry has agreed to halve the food waste before 2030. And we are on the road to success, as the food waste was reduced 10% over the last 5 years. Reducing the consumption of red meat has the highest mitigation potential in Norway across all sectors. The goal is to reduce the consumption, but this is hard to achieve. Still, we do see that the meat intake per person has stabilized the last 10 years. So perhaps we have seen peak meat. Let's turn to waste. 4 measures have successfully reduced landfill emissions: banning all biodegradable waste, recycle more waste, incinerate more waste, and lastly, burning methane from landfills. The waste volumes have increased, but these actions together have more than offset this effect. Lastly, I will mention oil and gas. In this sector, methane emissions have been limited due to a ban on flaring, a CO2 tax, a methane tax, and recycling of gas. If all countries implemented the same measures as we have done in Norway, global methane emissions from oil and gas operation would fall by more than 90%. So those were the few of our actions. I'll finish off with a couple of other lessons learned. The Norwegian Environment Agency analyzed mitigation measures for climate and air pollution together. We identify win-wins and win-lose. These studies also addresses health and both the short and the long-term effect on climate. And this creates a better basis for decision-making. Over to collaboration, 2 examples. In the Arctic Council, the members set the world's first quantitative goal to reduce black carbon. Please be inspired to set goals for your region. I'm also co-chairing a project with China. This project will provide policy recommendations to maximize the benefits of emission measures, both with respect to air quality and climate change. And to sum up, we all know that we have extremely limited time. I urge you to both think long-term and short-term, to think air quality and climate change. Finally, we must act now, and we must collaborate and learn from each other along the way. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank all the panelists again for giving us those kind of insights and snapshots of activities going on in the different countries. So we get the next and final group of panelists we're going to hear from. They will be reflecting on the scientific case for action on short-lived climate pollutants and country-level action. So first we have Peter Derry, who is the Director of Climate Change for Ghana's Ministry of Environment. As co-chair of the CCAC Governing Board, Mr. Derry helped develop CCAC 2030 strategy to address the 1.5 degree target. He has also been instrumental in the coordination of SLCP National Action Plan for Ghana and the integration of SLCPs in the updated nationally distributed contributions. The next member of the panel is Glinda Bathan Baterina, who is the Deputy Executive Director of Clean Air Asia. She is a lawyer with 20 years of experience in policy and program development for clean air, sustainable transport, industrial emissions control, and climate change mitigation. And finally, we have Dr. Alice Alpert, who is a senior scientist in the Office of the Chief Scientist for the Environmental Defense Fund. She leads an initiative to characterize and address choke points in realizing the potential of climate mitigation technologies. In her previous role at the US State Department, she represented the United States in the IPCC and UNFCCC. She also served as US focal point for the CCAC and the Arctic Council's expert group on black carbon and methane. So first up, we have Mr. Derry of Ghana.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. As has been said this morning, we need to think globally, but definitely we have to act locally. And so I wish to share a few experiences back home with you from Ghana. The science is very clear, both at the global level and also at the national level. From our domestic calculations, it is clear that if we embark on a path to reduce emissions, especially methane, we would be able to reduce about 20% of our current target of 64 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2030. So methane for us is very critical when it comes to meeting our NDC targets. It has also been shown from our domestic calculations that we can reduce 2,000 deaths annually due to indoor pollution and other related pollution from the generation of short-lived climate pollutants within the country. So the science is very clear. So what do we have to do? A number of things. The first is to look at policy reforms and regulatory reforms. The second for us is to look at technology transfer and reforming our infrastructure. The third is to forge partnerships to mobilize the necessary resources for implementation in country. And the fourth has to do with capacity building and ensuring that we have a robust monitoring and reporting system. Now, I want to share a few examples on the policy front. Ghana is one of the first countries, or let me say within the West African sub-region, the first country to reduce sulfur to 50 ppm. And this has caught up with the rest of the sub-region. Now we have a sub-regional policy that does not allow countries to go beyond that particular standard that has been set. That's number one. And that was true policy reform. Secondly, we, for the first time, have set our vehicle emission standards. And we are currently developing regulations to ensure that implementation and enforcement of the standards are done on the ground. The third most important policy area has to do with oil and gas. Ghana has a no flaring policy for oil and gas. However, we concede that due to our inadequate infrastructure, we allow for limited level of flaring. When it comes to technology transfer, we equally have a number of examples to share. When it comes to agriculture, we are currently introducing what is known as the alternative wet and drying program to reduce emissions from rice production in farm fields. We are also introducing the e-vehicles. A number of assembly plants have now set up in Ghana and are assembling e-vehicles. We even have what is known as e-vehicle taxis that are emerging in Ghana. In addition, there is penetration of clean cook stoves and LPG. Currently, the penetration level for LPG is around 45% of the total population. When it comes to forging partnerships we have been able to develop an Article 6 implementation framework, first of its kind in Africa. And we have entered into a number of agreements with many countries. Ghana-Switzerland agreement is a clear example. We are still working with Sweden, Singapore, and many others to ensure that we have such more agreements. In terms of capacity, we've been able to develop a robust climate hub, which is a one-stop reporting system to ensure that we're able to report on issues related to SLCPs and also short-lived calamity pollutants and also methane at the UNFCCC. There are many examples, but of course I can see the signal to stop. And so I will end here and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Our next speaker is Glenda Bathan-Batarina of Clean Air Asia.
Thank you very much to the organizers for this opportunity to share experience of Clean Air Asia and partners of the CCAC. The Global Methane Assessment by CCAC and UNEP related a clear story on methane globally. What are its sources, why we should be moved to act, where lies the greatest mitigation potential, what is the cost of inaction, in which sectors do we need champions, and what is the strategy to winning. We need to work on similar assessments with our country partners to tell the story of air pollutants and greenhouse gas emissions, including methane, SLCPs, and CO2. Specifically, the sources, what the future looks like in the absence of action, what actions are needed, what benefits action brings, where a country's efforts should be directed. According to the Global Methane Assessment, the mitigation potential varies between countries and regions. In the Asia-Pacific region, excluding China and India, it is coal and waste. In India, the waste sector, and in China, the largest potential is from coal production, followed by livestock. And because subnational governments are often much closer to the problems and the impacts of air pollution and climate change, they too need to be fully engaged in integrating clean air, SLCP, and climate action planning, whether it be in improving municipal solid waste management systems or improving public transport. One of the countries that CCAC, Clean Air Asia, and Stockholm Environment Institute are working with is the government of Pakistan, specifically the Ministry of Climate Change. Pakistan joined the CCAC in 2017. Since then, it has made substantial progress in integrating air pollution and climate change planning into its national and international commitments. In 2021, Pakistan's updated NDC set a target to reduce total GHG emissions by 50% by 2030. It also identified 2 actions that would be undertaken to further integrate air pollution and health co-benefits from climate change mitigation within its planning and policy making on climate change. First, it committed to updating Pakistan's Clean Air Plan to establish new air quality targets and aligning these with their climate change goals. Second, it committed to the development of an integrated assessment of air pollution and climate change mitigation to identify the air pollution co-benefits that could be achieved from implementation of its climate change commitments. Clean Air Asia, SEI, and CCAC supported the Ministry of Climate Change in this assessment. This assessment quantifies historic air pollutant and greenhouse gas emissions for Pakistan from 2010 to 2021 at the national and subnational scale for 4 provinces, 2 regions, and the Federal Capital Territory separately. The assessment projects emissions to the future to 2050 for a business as usual scenario and quantifies the emission reduction potential from the implementation of 18 concrete mitigation actions across major source sectors and relates these to reductions in particulate matter exposure and improvements in public health. The implementation of all 18 mitigation measures assessed could result in an 82.8 reduction in PM2.5 emissions and a 21.9% reduction in total GHG emissions by 2050. Several of the measures assessed have the potential to simultaneously reduce emissions of air pollutants and greenhouse gases. For example, increasing the share of electricity generated from renewable sources results in significant reductions in NOx, SO2, CO2 emissions, and switching to more efficient brick kilns reduces PM, black carbon, and CO2. Following COP26, Pakistan was one of 120 countries to sign up to the Global Methane Pledge, which committed countries to reducing emissions of methane by 30% compared to 2020 levels by 2030. The assessment report highlights that a large contribution of Pakistan's total GHG emissions are due to methane, which contributed 47.4% to the country's total GHG emissions in 2021. The assessment also highlights 4 measures across 3 sectors which could result in a 19% reduction in methane emissions by 2030 compared to a baseline level. And these measures are reducing emissions from enteric fermentation, for example, from improving feed for livestock, capturing methane from landfills and from liquid waste, and reducing oil and gas flaring. Implementing these measures would substantially contribute towards Pakistan achieving its commitment towards the Global Methane Pledge, but would also lead to a 9.7% reduction in total greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, helping it to achieve its climate ambition under its commitment to the UNFCCC as part of the 2015 Paris Agreement. Now I'll take the last minute to speak about the support needed by countries. Our greatest hope, of course, is that the countries that have signed up to the Methane Pledge develop their methane action plans and start to implement them way ahead of the 2030 target, and that in 2025, when countries submit updates to their NDCs, that they include ambitious methane reduction targets. To make this happen, developing countries need training in conducting assessments as part of integrated clean air, SLCP, and climate action planning at national and subnational levels, training on the solutions to methane mitigation, and post-training support. Pushing a regulation through a national ministry with meager staff resources is no joke. Technical assistance and expert help is often needed, as well as stakeholder engagement. Support for integrated action planning, which allows sectoral agencies to work closely together and break down silos, is needed. This is especially important if the planning for air pollution mitigation is done by an agency separate from the agency that plans for climate change mitigation. Resources to implement action at national and subnational level are needed. And lastly, we need to generate accountability. If subnational leaders' performance or career development or career advancement cannot be made dependent on their meeting targets, then we need to generate accountability through more creative ways, such as through benchmarking exercises showing where the leaders are and identifying where more help should be directed, or an award system that incentivizes action. Thank you.
Speaker is Alice Alford of the Environmental Defense Fund.
Hello, it's great to see a lot of familiar faces. We've just heard a lot about the case, the very strong case for reducing methane emissions and a lot of low-hanging fruit in the oil and gas supply chain. And there are proven common sense measures that can and should be put into place now to reduce those emissions. But as we look to reduce them even further, it will be valuable to have an even more precise understanding of exactly how much of those emissions there are and where they're coming from. So the bottom up, what we call activity-based, which is based on the known sources of emissions, of any greenhouse gas, but in particular, we're talking about methane here, are used to construct national inventory estimates. And they can, in some cases, underestimate, and in others, overestimate methane emissions, particularly in the oil and gas supply chain. And in fact, recent research has shown that in some cases, the initial assumptions without additional measurement-based data would point to the wrong sources to target for abatement. Now, how do we know that? Well, in 2018 and 2019, a group of international scientists supported by the CCAC's Science Study Series, including my colleagues at the Environmental Defense Fund, conducted a series of airborne measurements, an entire campaign actually, in Mexico, looking at some of the largest oil and gas producing basins. And so this involved aircraft flyovers, directly measuring the atmosphere and the gases. And they also looked at satellite-based remote sensing data. And the results were surprising. On one hand, so they were looking at both offshore and onshore regions within the territory of Mexico. And for the offshore emissions, the directly measured estimates showed emissions that were 10 times lower than what would have been expected just by adding up all the known sources. And now conversely, in the onshore area, the direct measurements showed 10 times larger emissions than would be expected just by adding up the known sources. And overall, this suggested that the total national emissions from oil and gas were twice as large as previously expected. Now that's important, but what's really important is that these results point to targeting the onshore areas and reducing venting and flaring there as the key mitigation option to focus on, rather than the previously available inventories would have mistakenly pointed to the offshore production areas to focus on. So an effective strategy to reduce these emissions could yield significant reduction in wasted gas, making it possible to reduce imports and yielding significant mitigation benefits. And in fact, this June, Mexico's President López Obrador announced that the national oil company Pemex will be pursuing methane gas capture projects. So what does all this science tell us going forward? So it shows that inventories and estimates of emissions need to incorporate directly measured data in order to best inform abatement strategies. Now, is this easy? No, it took years to just do the single study that I just described. But, and the bottom-up approach of adding up all the known sources is something that many countries around the world are working very hard to accomplish just in itself. And it can be made even more valuable by including this additional data. And the example that I just described in Mexico is not the only one. It's also been done in the US. It's been done in Switzerland a little bit differently. We heard some really, really great words from Catherine McKenna about what efforts Canada will be doing. So I hope that over the next few days, we'll be hearing a lot more about how to put these methodologies into practice and how to work to build capacity both on the bottom up and on the measurement-based aspects of emission inventories to really accelerate action. Thank you.
I'd like to thank our current speakers on this final panel and the speakers that we heard from in the previous two panels as well for a very interesting and informative session. We heard about the latest science in measuring and detection of short-lived climate pollutants, including methane and black carbon. And we saw, I think we all remember the first two panels that we saw of the importance of just taking action, what a difference taking action on methane alone can make. And then we heard from three different countries. We heard from policy and planning in three different areas and what the remaining challenges are, what successes have been achieved in those areas, and what the goals and targets are. And we just finished hearing about reflections from three different perspectives on country level actions. And I'm sure from each of those segments, we took away some key nuggets. And I recall the three races from the first segment. I recall pick meat from the second one. And and I recall, I think globally and act locally is a really key one, which brings everything together. The thinking globally is all of us coming together in sessions such as this and making those connections and building those networks, but then leveraging those into partnerships at the ground level, at the local level to take action at those levels. So thank you for your patience in staying with us throughout the session. And this brings us to the end of the first, to the plenary of the first day. Thank you very much.